If every mastering engineer is already using peak limiting, every runner in the race has already taken steroids. Bobcat's mastering audio. You've balanced your master, you've got all the macro and microdynamics dialed in, serving the music in its best way, and you're ready to finalize it. Add your final limiter and go that one more.
Exactly. One louder.
But every time you start to push your limiter, things start to break up. Not sound the way they're intended, not get the overall volume or the overall movement of the music right. Today I'm going to show you step by step how I set up my final limiter in my mastering chain using FabFilter Pro L2. How I dial in attack and release times, use oversampling, use look ahead, and what style of limiting I'm actually using in FabFilter Pro L2. And even if you're not using FabFilter Pro L2, a lot of these principles will apply to you and whatever professional limiter you're using in your chain. Let's start with the style of limiting. So the style of limiting I'm using is transparent mode, 9 times out of 10. Sometimes I'll use all round or modern, but most of the time I'm using transparent mode. The reason being is it retains the most amount of transient quality to my ears and has the lowest extension in the sub frequencies. A lot of the other ones, they start to taper it off, make the mid-range a little bit more present, whereas this just feels super neutral to my ear. The one thing to note with transparent mode, it's really easy to over push it because it is allowing a little bit more transient detail to come through. It's more prone to overshoots, which means you're more prone to having digital overs, audible distortion and clipping. So even in the first release of this, they made mention of using the look ahead under half a second to help combat that. But even then, I'm only choosing to use the look ahead on this style only when I do hear those artifacts. Otherwise, I try and keep it as, hands-off approach as possible when I'm using a limiter. Secondly is oversampling. I'm not going to go do a full 101 on oversampling, but I'm going to quickly give you a spiel of why you're going to want to have your oversampling turned on. When using any dynamic processing on a signal, sometimes harmonics are introduced. Now, if those harmonics fall between 0 to 20 kilohertz or 22.1 kilohertz if you're working at 44.1 or 24 kilohertz if you're working at 48, no harm done. But if those harmonics are outside of the bandwidth of the given sample rate, it starts to alias and starts to fold those frequencies back down as really weird sort of harmonics that sound like bird chirping or metallic-y noises. Now, what oversampling does is it opens up the bandwidth, it multiplies the bandwidth of the processor to allow for those harmonics to be introduced above the given or native sample rate of the session before then using simple integer mathematics to divide it back down into the original sample rate session. So I use an oversampling of 8 times. That's probably an overkill, but my CPU manages it perfectly fine. But anyway, I've got a video more in detail. It's not my video, it's somebody else's video explaining oversampling, and I think it's worth checking out. So anyway, that's the second setting. Set your oversampling at 8 times or 2 times. Just set it so that way you're avoiding any aliasing and artifacts introducing into the signal. Now I've got this setting in, I love dialing in my limiter the Mike Stavro way. For mixing with your mind, the way he sets his compressors up is exactly the same way I set up my limiter in mastering. So I'll give you a little rundown. I start with the gain completely cranked. I want to hear everything this limiter is doing to my signal. I want to hear how fast it's coming in, how fast it's releasing. I really just want to hear the full effect. It's not going to be the final limiter setting, obviously, but that's where I like to start. I like to start with an attack of about 150 milliseconds and a release of 75. And then I start to tweak. So the first thing I'm going to do is play back this signal from On My Own by Morning Maxwell, and it's going to sound distorted and horrible and going all over the place, and my aim is to get this attack working so I can hear the punch and the transient come through. They're not too squashed, but in the same respect there's not too much punch clipping and going through. So that's how I start setting it up. So let's have a listen. Okay, I like it there, about 100. Any slower, you allow too much signal in, and you can hear that signal going way too through the limit. It's actually not controlling any transient, and you're going to get overshoots. Too fast, like we're talking 40 milliseconds, 30 milliseconds, it starts to smear the top. For this song, 100 milliseconds, that feels good to my ear. The second setting is to dial in this release time. Now, follow along here. It might sound funny hearing all that distortion going on in that, but now I usually start with my release at 75 millisecond. I'll dial that back as I go, and I'll dial it back to the point where that distortion starts to smear out. That's just what works for me, and I'm going to show you that now.
time in my life, plus work on myself and the work's a dream. I don't need you, I just need me. I don't need stones, I need the sea breeze. Feeling that I get.
Okay, that's the release, slightly dialed back. Now the thing with release, the faster the release, the more in your face and loud the overall signal is going to sound. And the slower it is, the more smeared, the more smooth it's going to sound. It's really important that you find that balance, usually somewhere between 75 milliseconds to 300 milliseconds is the range I'm working within. And, you know, this one I've ended up at 225. Now there's still a little bit of artifacts. I know there's quite a lot of low end in this, so I'm just going to use this look ahead a little bit, maybe 0.02, 0.05, just to get it looking ahead a little bit of the signal and anticipating any big transients coming in.
I'm in my life, plus work on myself and the work's a dream. I don't need you, I just need me. I don't need stones, I need.
Before we bring this gain back down to a reasonable level, I'm going to A-B the limiter without having the attack and release dialed in compared to with it actually dialed in properly. All right, so we'll compare the two, and then you can hear, oh, I didn't mean to hit you, and then we can hear the slight subtleties and differences and changes that have been made by tweaking those attack and release times appropriately.
I'm in my life, plus work on myself and the work's a dream. I don't need you, I just need me. I don't need stones, I need the sea breeze.
You can hear it, it's much cleaner when I'm on the A version as opposed to the B version, just because my attack and release times are dialed in. Now, we're not going to have 30 decibels of gain on the final one. We're going to bring this back down to 0.2, have our ceiling at negative 0.2, and bring this gain up to where we're hitting about anywhere between half a decibel of gain reduction to 1.5 decibels of gain reduction. Using my ears, of course, to hear how it's sitting, how those settings are sitting when I'm pushing it, but I'm hoping it remains relatively transparent, void of any artifacts, and is just moving with the music. I'm getting all those little details that are lovely in the mix, which I enjoyed while I was mastering it, but not destroying it by over limiting it. And anything more than that, you will hear the limiter working against the music. You can start to hear that movement, that 2 decibels of gain reduction happening. So half a decibel to 1.5 decibel, that's about as much gain reduction you're wanting to use, and it'll just bring it into, for at least me when I do it, it brings it to a point where it's a competitive volume. I haven't overcompromised the dynamics of my work, I've just lifted it up enough.
I'm in my life, plus work on myself and the work's a dream. I don't need you, I just need me. I don't need stones, I need the sea breeze. Feeling that I get when I'm on my own. Get to spend time in my life, I'm in my life, plus work on myself and the work's a dream. I don't need you, I just need me. I don't need stones, I need the sea breeze. Feeling that I get when I'm on my own. Get to spend time in my life, I'm in.
And that's all you need to lift up the overall volume. When you're using a limiter, remember, slow attack, lots of transient, potential distortion, potential artifacts, not a lot of control with your sound. Super fast attack, everything's smeared. Super slow release, everything's smeared, but you've got a little bit more room to wiggle. But super fast release, it's very punchy, very in your face, and can distort as well. So there's a few options here to sort of fiddle with, and hope this video showed you a little bit about how I set my limiter. If it helps you, that makes me all the more happier. And I'm going to leave you guys with that, because I'm going to go eat some lunch now. I'm feeling hungry. Press the like button, share, subscribe, and until next time, take care.